in the misty fjords and dark forests of Scandinavia, where the wind howled through the pines and the sea churned with the promise of adventure. Looking out over the sea were longships with fearsome dragon heads cut through the waves. The Vikings believed that their destiny was shaped by the gods. The saga of the Volsungs, for instance, tells the story of Sigurd, a legendary Viking hero whose life is marred by the actions of others. The Vikings followed a kind of ritualized revenge, which was often structured and governed by tradition. If someone killed a family member, for example, the injured party had the right to seek revenge, but only in certain ways and under certain conditions. The act of revenge could not be taken lightly. It had to be carried out with respect for the rules of their society, often in the form of a public act, and sometimes under the supervision of a respected elder or chieftain who could mediate the action. This ritualized form of justice ensured that the Vikings didn't descend into chaos or anarchy. He is the son of Sigmund, whose death is avenged by Sigurd in a bloody series of events involving betrayal, love, and ultimately, the slaying of the dragon Fafnir. This saga is filled with the themes of revenge and honor, illustrating how the Vikings saw their lives not as a series of isolated incidents, but as part of a larger, cyclical battle for honor. The Vikings were not simply warriors, they were deeply spiritual, and their rituals played a crucial role in solidifying the power of their codes. From the sacred oaths taken in front of gods to the warrior ceremonies that marked the passage from youth to adulthood, these rituals shaped the very fabric of Viking society. We'll take a closer look at the sacrificial rites, blots, and how these practices helped reinforce the importance of loyalty, vengeance, and divine favor in Viking culture, and that their actions in life would determine their place in the afterlife. For them, while revenge was considered a necessary response to dishonor, it also created endless conflict, and the continuous cycle of violence had the potential to tear apart entire communities. Whole clans could be wiped out because of a single act of revenge, creating a lasting legacy of bitterness and hatred. The Vikings, despite their valor and honor, were often trapped in these endless cycles of bloodshed, with no clear way to break free. Life was a constant battle for survival and status. But how did this relentless war for dominance translate into the world of honor codes and blood feuds? The Vikings forged a code of life and death that shaped their world. Honor wasn't just a personal matter. It was a matter of family, of clan, and of reputation. The Vikings, like many other cultures, lived and died by their word. If you insulted someone, or worse, violated the honor of their family, it was considered a grave offense, often worthy of death or destruction. Unlike today, where justice is meted out by the state, in Viking society, revenge was a personal responsibility, carried out by the wronged party or their kin. This sense of honor and duty was cemented in the Viking Code of Honor, a set of unwritten laws that dictated how to act in moments of conflict and how to deal with betrayal, insult, and crime. The Viking Age was not just an era of conquest and exploration. It was also an age steeped in the blood of feuds, where honor and revenge were the ultimate currency. To understand the bloody feuds of the Vikings, we must first delve into the foundation of their society, a place where family, honor, and vengeance were intertwined like the intricate knotwork of Norse mythology. Imagine standing on the edge of a rugged cliff. The answer lies in the Viking concept of honor, an almost sacred idea that governed everything. At the heart of Viking feuds was the idea of revenge. Unlike the more formalized systems of justice we're familiar with today, Viking society didn't rely on kings or councils to settle disputes. Instead, revenge was the responsibility of the victim or their family. If you were wronged, whether through an insult, the killing of a relative, or the theft of property, it was your duty to seek vengeance. Failure to do so would result in the loss of honor, not just for you, but for your entire family. This was the essence of blood feuds, a cycle of retaliatory violence that could last for generations. One of the most famous examples of Viking feuds comes from the sagas, the ancient stories passed down through generations that detail the bloody conflicts between families. While revenge was a key aspect of Viking society, it wasn't always about mindless violence. However, the cycle of blood feuds could also be deeply destructive. In the next section, we will explore the rituals that accompanied these bloody feuds. The Viking worldview was dominated by the concept of honor, a concept that permeated every aspect of life, from the simplest of daily interactions to the most profound rituals. When a wrong was committed, whether it be an insult to personal pride or a grievous act of violence, it was not just a personal matter, but a matter of collective responsibility. Thus, their battles, feuds, and acts of revenge were deeply ritualized. These rituals not only served to reinforce the importance of revenge, but also ensured that the warriors were acting within the bounds of their society's moral and spiritual codes. In the ritual, the warrior would offer a sacrifice, often in the form of an animal, and pour its blood onto the sacred tree or fire. It was believed that these rituals brought divine power into the realm of men, channeling the gods' energy directly into the battle for vengeance. The power of the gods was harnessed through the ritual act of sacrifice, ensuring that the vengeance would be swift and that the killer's deeds were justified by divine law. This would be accompanied by oaths or vows, spoken aloud before the gods, pledging vengeance and a desire for victory. The oath was not just a personal promise, it was a social contract. It held the fabric of the clan together, ensuring that every member upheld the values of loyalty and retribution. The Volva would give cryptic advice or predictions, often in the form of poetry or riddles. These prophecies, which were believed to come from the gods themselves, could influence a warrior's decision to engage in a conflict or whether he was on the right path to exacting revenge. When Viking families and warriors swore these oaths, they were not simply taking responsibility for their actions. They were invoking the gods' will to carry out the vengeance in a just manner. Without the blessings or guidance of the gods, the warriors risked fighting in vain, or worse, incurring the wrath of the gods for acting unjustly. The seer's presence in Viking feuds added an element of mysticism, where actions in the physical world were linked with cosmic forces beyond mortal understanding. On one hand, it ensured that their honor would always be upheld, and any violation would be swiftly and decisively dealt with. We'll also examine how the changing landscape of Europe and the rise of Christianity began to challenge the Viking way of life and the cultural practices that had sustained them for centuries. On the other hand, the endless fighting often led to deep divisions within Viking societies, with entire families or clans being destroyed by a single act of vengeance. Their language was not merely a tool of communication, but a weapon and a binding force. Even figures like Odin, who was revered for his wisdom, could be seen perpetuating the violence of these cycles, fighting wars that stretched over centuries. It was common for these feuds to escalate, as one death was avenged by another, and one battle led to a series of retaliations. Sometimes, these cycles of revenge could span generations, as each new conflict was tied to the sins of the past. If a Viking was wronged, whether his family was killed, his property stolen, or his honor insulted, he could swear an oath to seek revenge. The notion of honor and revenge, embedded in their rituals and codes, has endured in modern culture, especially in literature and film, where Viking-like warriors and their quest for vengeance continue to captivate audiences. This vow, known as a blood oath, was often taken in front of witnesses, adding gravity to the commitment. The seers, or volvas, were revered in Viking society for their ability to communicate with the gods and foresee the future. These women were believed to have the ability to enter a trance-like state, during which they could receive visions or prophecies. The blood oath bound the person to the task. The Viking could not back out or refuse to seek revenge without losing his honor. If he failed in his mission, his family's reputation would be tarnished, and he would live with the shame for the rest of his days. When a Viking swore an oath, whether to avenge a death, defend a friend, or embark on a raid, it was considered sacred. The word of a Viking was his bond, and breaking it could lead to disgrace and dishonor, something far worse than death. The act of swearing an oath in front of the gods was not something taken lightly. To break that oath was to lose all honor, and the gods would turn their backs on such individuals, rendering them powerless. These were not mindless acts of savagery. They were sacred, controlled expressions of justice. This is where the infamous Viking blood feuds began, and where the codes of honor were most fiercely upheld. But how did the Vikings make sense of the often violent and chaotic nature of their world? They used ritual. They found ways to give meaning to their actions, transforming what could have been endless bloodshed into something that was at least culturally and spiritually significant. The Vikings, like other warrior societies, understood that fighting and killing, while necessary for survival, should not be done recklessly. One of the most significant rituals in Viking society was the blot, a form of sacrifice and prayer offered to the gods to gain their favor. The Vikings believed that their gods, especially Odin, the god of war and wisdom, demanded sacrifices in exchange for divine protection, strength, and success in battle. The blot could be a sacrifice of animals, such as horses or cattle, or even human sacrifices during times of great need or war. When a Viking sought revenge or was about to embark on a battle to settle the feud, he would often perform a blot to secure the god's favor. These rituals were often held in sacred groves or temples dedicated to Thor or Odin. But even the more modest Viking home would have its own sacred space for such offerings. The Vikings were a people who understood the significance of spoken words. Oaths of vengeance were especially sacred. This sense of commitment and duty was one of the cornerstones of Viking society. While the codes of revenge and honor were primarily enforced through oaths and rituals, the Vikings also looked to the spiritual realm for guidance. Before going to battle, especially in a blood feud, a Viking warrior or chieftain might seek out a seer to gain divine insight into the outcome of the conflict. The role of the seer was vital in ensuring that the vengeance carried out by the Vikings was divinely sanctioned. The Viking concept of revenge was cyclical. Once a wrong was committed, the call for vengeance would begin, and the cycle of blood feuds would unfold. This constant cycle of violence was both a curse and a blessing for the Vikings. This concept of an unbroken revenge cycle is reflected in many of the Viking sagas, where the Norse gods themselves were often caught up in these cycles of vengeance. Despite the inherent dangers of blood feuds, they were an integral part of Viking society, and their influence persisted long after the Viking Age ended. As we move into the next section, we will explore how the Viking warrior ethos and their codes of conduct influenced their martial strategies and their interactions with other cultures. Vikings were not only known for their seafaring skills, but also for their brutal efficiency in battle. Their warrior ethos, governed by a strict code of honor and rituals, made them one of the most feared groups in Europe. But behind the famous raids and blood feuds lay a complex structure of beliefs, strategies, and traditions that shaped the Viking warriors into elite combatants. One of the most iconic symbols of Viking warrior culture is the berserker. The berserkers were not just ordinary warriors. They were a terrifying breed of fighter, known for their fearlessness and violent frenzy in battle. Their name, berserker, is thought to derive from the Old Norse words bear and serk, indicating that they wore animal pelts, often of bears or wolves, and fought with a wild, animalistic ferocity. The berserkers were believed to enter a state of frenzied rage during battle, losing all sense of fear or pain and attacking with the strength and power of a beast. Some sagas even describe them as having the ability to channel the spirit of an animal, becoming as relentless and unstoppable as the creatures they mimicked. In this state, they would fight with reckless abandon, tearing through enemy lines, driven by sheer primal force. The berserkers' behavior, however, wasn't purely physical. Their frenzied rage was also believed to have a mystical aspect. Viking warriors often considered the berserkers to be blessed by the gods, especially Odin, who was associated with war and chaos. Their fury was a form of divine favor, granted by Odin himself. For a Viking leader, having a group of berserkers in the ranks was a sign of strength and divine backing. These warriors were often the shock troops of Viking raids, acting as the tip of the spear in battle. However, despite their reputation for savagery, berserkers were not invincible. The state of madness that empowered them also made them prone to reckless behavior. They often faced disastrous consequences after battle, including wounds, death, or madness. Their fury left them vulnerable to fatigue and disorientation, and in the aftermath of battle, many berserkers struggled to return to normalcy, their minds and bodies broken by the violent chaos they had embraced. The Viking shield wall was another crucial element of Viking martial strategy. This tight formation, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable wall of shields and spears, was designed to protect the warriors from enemy attacks while allowing them to retaliate in a disciplined, coordinated manner. The shield wall was a symbol of Viking unity and discipline in battle. The formation was as much about psychological warfare as it was about tactics. A Viking shield wall was an intimidating sight, a massive, solid front of battle-ready men, each with their shield raised, staring down the enemy. The strength of the shield wall was not just in the individual warriors, but in the collective effort. Each warrior relied on the others to maintain the wall's integrity, knowing that any breach would lead to the destruction of the formation and potentially the death of many. The effectiveness of the shield wall was proven in countless Viking battles. In raids on England and France, the Vikings used the shield wall to overwhelm enemies, holding off larger forces and creating devastating openings for their raiding parties. The battle formations were not just about brute strength. They were about using a structured, unified front to maintain control of the battlefield. The shield wall allowed Vikings to maximize the power of their axes, swords, and spears, turning them into a synchronized, deadly force. While the warriors themselves were formidable, the true strength of the Viking war effort lay in their longships. The longship was a marvel of Viking craftsmanship, designed for speed, agility, and versatility on both the open sea and shallow rivers. These ships allowed Vikings to conduct surprise raids deep into enemy territory, far away from their homeland. Their ability to navigate the rivers of Europe and make swift landings on unexpected shores was one of the most feared aspects of Viking warfare. The longship was built for warfare, with sleek, narrow hulls and dragon-head prows that struck terror into the hearts of those who saw them. The Vikings' mastery of these ships gave them an edge in both strategic and tactical terms. Not only did the ships allow them to travel great distances and conquer far-off lands, but they also gave them the ability to strike at any moment and disappear just as quickly. When a Viking fleet approached, it was as though a storm had arrived. The longships, often armed with up to 50 oars, could move at incredible speeds, making them difficult to intercept. Their shallow draft allowed them to sail into shallow waters, where larger ships could not go, and make surprise attacks on villages or towns near the coast. Once the raid was complete, the fleet could quickly retreat back into the sea, leaving no trace but the destruction they left behind. After the battle was over, the Viking warriors didn't simply walk away. Their code of honor dictated that the aftermath of battle was just as important as the battle itself. A Viking warrior's reputation was built not just on his actions in battle, but on how he conducted himself afterwards. A warrior who fought bravely and honorably would gain respect and renown. But a warrior who fled the battlefield or dishonored his comrades would face disgrace and shame. In the wake of battle, it was common for the victors to share the spoils, weapons, armor, gold, and livestock. The Vikings were known for their loyalty to their comrades, and it was essential that a warrior did not leave the battlefield with more than his fair share of treasure. Spoils were distributed based on merit, ensuring that warriors who had fought the hardest and shown the most bravery were rewarded accordingly. The dead, both the Vikings and their enemies, were often honored with funeral rites. For the Vikings, this could mean being laid to rest in a burial mound or sent off on a boat, set alight with flames, and pushed out to sea. It was believed that the dead would need these honors to ensure their passage to the afterlife, where they could join the gods in Valhalla, Odin's hall, if they had proven themselves worthy. If a Viking had died in a battle or raid, his death was not seen as tragic, but as a passage to a noble afterlife, where eternal glory awaited those who had lived and died with honor. As the Viking Age came to an end in the 11th century, the old ways of war and revenge slowly gave way to the emergence of a more organized, Christianized society. The Viking raids, which had once struck fear into the hearts of Europe, came to an end as the Vikings began to settle down and form kingdoms in the lands they had once plundered. As Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the traditional Viking codes of honor and the ritualized violence that accompanied them began to be replaced by new laws and customs. However, the legacy of the Viking warrior ethos remained. The stories of Viking warriors, their codes of honor, and their martial prowess lived on in the sagas, stories that continue to inspire and fascinate to this day. The Viking values of courage, loyalty, and revenge are still evident in modern interpretations of Viking culture, reminding us of a time when men lived and died by their sword, their word, and their honor. In the next section, we will explore the final impact of Viking culture on modern Europe and the enduring influence of their warrior ethos on contemporary literature, popular culture, and the modern perception of the Viking legacy. The Vikings, like many ancient cultures, were deeply concerned with what would happen after death. Their views on the afterlife were intertwined with their warrior ethos, where the concept of honor was not just important in life, but was carried through to their beliefs about death. According to Viking mythology, those who died heroically in battle, fighting valiantly and without fear, were chosen by Valkyrie's female figures who served Odin to be taken to Valhalla. The Vikings believed that warriors who perished on the battlefield would continue to fight and train in Valhalla, always ready for the final battle during Ragnarok. It encouraged Viking warriors to fight fiercely, without fear of death. Those who did not die in battle, whether from illness, old age, or other causes, were believed to go to Hel, the realm of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel, the daughter of Loki. The honor of a warrior's life determined their final resting place. The way a Viking was laid to rest reflected their social status, their family, and most importantly, their honor. Viking funerals were grand events, and for a warrior, they were deeply significant. For less wealthy individuals, other methods were employed, such as cremation or earth burials in mounds. Even those who did not receive a grand ship burial were often buried with their personal belongings, ensuring that they would be well equipped in the next life. These burials also served to honor the deceased in front of the community, reinforcing the Viking belief that death was as much a part of life as any other event. The funeral was a public act, a reminder to the living of the importance of living honorably. Cremation was particularly popular during the earlier Viking period, while later Viking burials often involved placing the body in a tomb or a stone cairn, and the importance they placed on living and dying with dignity. We'll explore the gods they worshipped, the legendary creatures they feared, and how their mythology continues to influence contemporary culture. From their sacred rituals to their warrior ethos, the Vikings left behind a cultural imprint that continues to shape how we view death, honor, and the afterlife in modern society. The deceased's family had a significant role in ensuring that the memory of the dead was preserved. The continuation of a family's reputation after the death of a loved one was a matter of great pride. A family that failed to uphold the honor of their deceased ancestors would be viewed with shame, while one that celebrated their legacy would be honored by the community. The rituals surrounding the dead were thus a way of reinforcing the values of Viking society, ensuring that each family remained bound by the honor of their ancestors. Grave sites were maintained and visited regularly, as it was believed that the spirits of the dead could still influence the living. For this reason, family members would perform rituals at graves to ensure that the spirits were kept at peace and that they would continue to look after the living family members. The remains were often accompanied by weapons, tools, and ornaments, again reflecting the belief that the dead would need such items in their journey to the afterlife. The Vikings believed that the way one was buried could influence their afterlife. From Norse mythology to modern-day movies and video games, the concept of Valhalla continues to be a central theme. Films like Thor and Vikings, as well as games like God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, draw heavily on Viking mythology to portray a warrior's afterlife full of glory, honor, and battle. These depictions continue to romanticize the idea of the warrior's afterlife, showing how the Vikings' beliefs about death shaped not only their funeral practices, but their entire worldview. Thus, elaborate funerals were common, with the deceased being honored for their actions in life. For those who lived nobly and fought bravely, the reward was the eternal glory of Valhalla. For those who did not, hell represented a quiet, uneventful afterlife, but one that was not punishing or harsh. It was a place where the dead could rest, but without the glory of the heroes in Valhalla. Hell was a cold, dark place, where the dead would reside in a shadowy existence, far from the glory of Valhalla. It was not a place of eternal punishment, but rather one of melancholy and silence, where the souls of those who had not earned a place in Valhalla would dwell for eternity. The deceased's body would be placed in a ship, along with various possessions, including weapons, food, and sometimes slaves or animals to accompany them in the afterlife. The ship would then be set alight and sent out to sea, allowing the soul of the dead to embark on their journey to the afterlife. This was a powerful symbolic gesture, signifying that the deceased had a long journey ahead, one that would carry them toward either Valhalla or hell, depending on their deeds. To die in battle was not seen as a tragedy, but as an honor, as it ensured that one would join Odin's hall and live a life of glory in the afterlife. This belief system shaped the way Vikings fought, lived, and viewed death. The idea was that those who lived and died with honor would be rewarded with an afterlife that mirrored the life they had led, one of constant battle, companionship, and glory. There, they were honored for their bravery and would spend eternity in feasting and fighting in preparation for the Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world. To the Vikings, how one died was just as significant as how one lived. The idea of a warrior's afterlife and the customs surrounding death offered insight into how deeply their culture was bound by honor, bravery, and fate. Perhaps the most famous aspect of Viking beliefs regarding the afterlife is Valhalla, the grand hall of Odin, where the bravest of warriors were said to reside after their deaths. Valhalla was not just a place for any warrior. It was reserved for those who had died a noble death. This belief in a warrior's afterlife was not simply spiritual or religious. It had profound social implications. But not all Vikings were destined for Valhalla. The concept of hell highlights the Vikings' belief that death was a continuation of the journey, but that it was not necessarily an egalitarian experience. Viking funeral rites were equally as important as their beliefs about the afterlife. For the wealthy and powerful, typically chieftains or great warriors, a ship burial was often the most prestigious form of burial. The ship burial, while most common among the elite, was not the only form of Viking burial. For the common Viking, the burial rites would still reflect the importance of the journey to the afterlife. The Vikings also placed great importance on legacy and the continuation of family honor after death. In Viking society, where honor was the cornerstone of personal identity, ensuring that the legacy of a fallen warrior was maintained was of utmost importance. Today, the Viking view of death and the afterlife still captures the imagination of many. The Vikings' legacy, particularly their beliefs in the afterlife, continues to inspire modern audiences, highlighting their fierce sense of honor. In the next section, we will delve into the complex and fascinating world of Viking myths and how these ancient stories reflect the Vikings' values, fears, and desires.